In the bustling city of New York, where skyscrapers meet the gray fog, Jason Miller grew up under the care of his father, Robert Miller, a successful businessman and owner of one of the largest real estate investment firms. Jason was Robert's only son, and he grew up believing that his father was his role model, a self-made man who rose from poverty to wealth through his intelligence and ambition. Robert always told his son that family was the most important thing in life, and that when the time came, Jason would inherit everything his father had built. Despite his constant busyness with work, Robert was keen on instilling this idea in his son's mind from a young age, assuring him that he would be the heir to his financial empire. But as Jason grew older, he began to notice that his father's promises were empty words. Robert spent most of his time at the office, and when he was home, his mind was always preoccupied with work or long phone calls. There was no room for real conversation between them, and Jason felt that his father treated him more like a shadow than a son. When Jason turned 18, he enrolled at Harvard University, as his father wanted, to study business administration. It was more his father's dream than his own, but Jason didn't object. He wanted to be worthy of his father's trust, to prove that he was capable of carrying the family's legacy. During his studies, Jason began working as an intern at his father's company, learning everything about business management, but something was missing. He didn't feel like a real part of this empire. One cold evening, while Jason was in his small office at his father's company, Robert walked in with a calm smile and placed a thick file in front of him. Jason opened the file to find a new investment plan inside. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Finally, a chance to prove himself. His father said in a firm voice, "This is an important project, and I'm leaving you in charge of overseeing it. I want to see if you're truly capable of managing real business." Jason felt excited. This was his first real test, an opportunity to show his father that he was ready to take on responsibility. He began working hard, spending long hours in the office, studying the project from all angles, and developing new strategies to ensure its success. But what Jason didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a dangerous game. A game he wasn't prepared for, one that would reveal his father's harsh truth and the fact that he was never part of his future plans. Weeks passed quickly, and Jason worked tirelessly on the project his father had entrusted to him. The project involved developing a luxury residential complex in one of New York's most upscale neighborhoods, and Jason saw it as the perfect opportunity to prove himself. He studied the market, developed marketing plans, and coordinated with engineers and contractors, trying to prove to his father that he was worthy of his trust. But as he worked, he began to notice something strange. Some numbers in the budget didn't make sense, and large sums of money were being transferred to vague accounts with no clear names. At first, he thought they were just accounting errors, but as he dug deeper, he discovered that huge amounts were being funneled to an unknown company called Rockville Investments, a company he had never heard of. Jason decided to investigate further. He asked the company's CFO, but he avoided answering. This increased Jason's suspicions, so he researched the company himself, only to find that it was a shell company, a fake entity with no real employees, no office, just a name on paper. He felt uneasy, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions, so he decided to confront his father directly. The next morning, he entered his father's office. Robert was sitting behind his grand desk, flipping through some files. He looked up when he saw Jason and said with a slight smile, "What's wrong, son? You look tense." Jason hesitated for a moment before placing some documents in front of his father, pointing to the suspicious transactions. "Dad, I found these financial transfers to Rockville Investments, but there's no record of their actual activity. Who owns this company? And why are we sending them these amounts?" Robert looked at the papers, then let out a short laugh before leaning back in his chair. "Jason, these are complicated business matters. You won't understand them now. Things aren't always as they seem. Trust me, everything is under control." But his father's answer wasn't enough. Jason felt that something was being hidden, something his father didn't want him to know. "But Dad, this is the company's money, the investors' money. If there's something illegal going on, we need to clarify it." Robert's expression suddenly changed, and the warmth in his voice disappeared. "I told you, don't worry about this. Focus on your work and leave the rest to me." This was the first warning. Jason left the office feeling uneasy. All his life, he had believed his father was an honest man, someone who had built his empire with integrity. But now, he began to see a side of his father he had never known before, a dark side filled with secrets. Little did he know, this was just the beginning, and the truth he would later uncover would be far harsher than he imagined. After the tense confrontation with his father, Jason couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something off about Robert's reaction. It wasn't just a businessman hiding company secrets. It felt like he was hiding something bigger, something that could threaten everything he had built. Jason decided to uncover the truth himself. He began gathering more information about Rockville Investments. After several days of research, he found a lead, a partner registered in the company, a man named Frank Harris. The name didn't ring a bell, but it seemed important. With further research, Jason discovered that Frank Harris was an old partner of his father's, but he had disappeared over 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. It was said that he fled the country after being involved in a massive fraud case, but there was no concrete evidence. Jason felt he needed to talk to someone who knew the real story, so he decided to visit his aunt, Martha Miller, his father's older sister, who lived in an old house in the suburbs of New Jersey. Martha was known as the only person in the family who wasn't afraid to confront Robert. When he arrived at her house, the elderly woman greeted him with a wary expression, as if she had been expecting his visit. She sat him down in her living room, filled with old photos, and placed a cup of coffee in front of him before saying in a quiet but pained voice, "So, you've started to see the truth, haven't you?" Jason froze. "What do you mean?" Martha sighed and said, "Robert isn't the man you think he is. He's done many things to get where he is today, things that weren't legal and things that weren't ethical." Jason felt his heart racing. "Does this have something to do with Frank Harris?" His aunt looked at him sharply, then got up and pulled an old photo album from a drawer. She opened it to a specific page. There was an old photo of his father, standing next to a tall man with dark hair and sharp eyes, Frank Harris. They were partners in everything: business, money, and even crimes. Jason was shocked. "Crimes? What did my father do?" Martha sighed and said, "Robert didn't build his company just through hard work. He did it through fraud, money laundering, and taking over others' projects through illegal means. Frank was his main partner in all of that. But when some shady deals were exposed, Robert realized there was a risk, so he betrayed Frank and reported him to the authorities, forcing him to flee." The pieces began to fall into place in Jason's mind. "So, Rockville is still tied to him somehow." Martha shook her head. "Frank didn't disappear as you think. He's back, and he's demanding his share of what your father stole from him. This means your father will either cooperate with him or get rid of him." There was a moment of silence before Martha whispered, "Find the truth, but be careful, Jason. Your father isn't the man you think he is." Jason left his aunt's house feeling like his entire world had been turned upside down. His father, the man he had always respected, was nothing more than a deceitful traitor. And worse, there was a war on the horizon between him and his former partner. And he had no idea how dangerous this war would be. Jason returned to New York with his mind racing. The truth his aunt had revealed wasn't just a shock. It was an earthquake that destroyed everything he had believed in. He wanted to confront his father again, to make him admit everything. But he realized it wasn't that simple. His father was a dangerous man, and the truth wouldn't be easily extracted. So, Jason decided to play it smart. He began closely monitoring his father's actions, studying his movements, and trying to learn about his new deals. Through his connections within the company, he discovered that Robert was planning to meet an unknown person one night at a luxury hotel in Manhattan. Jason didn't need more clues. He knew this meeting would be with Frank Harris. That night, Jason rented a room at the same hotel, confident he could see what was happening. He sat in the lobby, disguised with a hat and sunglasses, watching carefully. After an hour of waiting, he saw his father enter, accompanied by 2 bodyguards. Robert sat in a distant corner, and minutes later, Frank Harris appeared. Frank had changed from the photo Jason had seen at his aunt's house. He was older, with gray hair and eyes filled with anger. He sat across from Robert, and they spoke quietly at first, but the conversation soon turned into a muted argument. Jason couldn't hear the conversation, but from their body language, it was clear that Frank was demanding something, and his father was refusing. After a few minutes, Frank stood up angrily, threw some papers on the table, and stormed off. Robert remained seated for a moment, frowning, before picking up the papers and slowly tearing them apart. It was clear that the war had begun. Jason left the hotel before his father, but now he knew something important. Frank was no longer just a ghost from the past. He was a real opponent demanding his share, and his father was willing to do anything to protect himself. In the following days, Jason began to feel like he was being watched. A black car was parked near his apartment every night, and sometimes he saw the same face in different places. This wasn't a coincidence. One night, as he was returning home, he received an anonymous call. "Stop digging, Jason. This isn't your business." The voice was deep, but it wasn't his father's. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "Who is this?" There was no answer, just a faint whistle before the call ended. Jason realized that he wasn't just facing his father's betrayal. He had become part of a dangerous game that could cost him his life. Jason began living in a state of constant anticipation, feeling as if eyes were watching his every move. He knew he had gotten too close to his father's secrets, but he wasn't ready to back down. He wanted to know the truth, no matter the cost. The next day, he decided to visit his Aunt Martha again. But when he arrived at her house, he found the door wide open. His heart raced as he entered cautiously. "Aunt Martha?" he called softly, but there was no answer. He wandered through the house, finding signs that someone had ransacked the place. Drawers overturned, books scattered, and torn papers strewn across the floor. He ran to the living room, where an old family photo had fallen and shattered on the ground. Jason realized that someone had beaten him there, and they were looking for something. But he didn't know if his aunt was safe or not. He quickly pulled out his phone and called her, but the line was dead. A chill ran through him. Had she been kidnapped? Or had she fled before they could catch her? Amid the chaos, he noticed something small on the table that hadn't been there before. A small key with a silver ring engraved with the letter R. He picked it up carefully, trying to understand its meaning. He knew this wasn't something his aunt had left by accident. It was a message for him. He left the house quickly, drove back to New York, and his mind was filled with questions. Who had done this? Could his father be behind it? But before he could think further, he received an anonymous text. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like her." Anger surged through him. This was no longer just about uncovering his father's secrets. It had become personal. If someone thought they could intimidate him, they were mistaken. Jason had now decided to go all the way, and he knew this was just the beginning. Jason held the small key tightly, trying to process everything that had happened. His Aunt Martha had disappeared, her house had been ransacked, and the anonymous text confirmed that someone was watching and threatening him. But the most pressing question was, what did this key open? He returned to his apartment and locked the doors securely. Sitting at his desk, he turned the key over in his hand, trying to solve the mystery. It wasn't a regular house or cabinet key. It looked like a safety deposit box key. He began researching banks in New York, trying to figure out which one his family had accounts with. He couldn't contact his father directly, as that would reveal his hand. But he remembered something important. Years ago, as a child, he had accompanied his father to an old bank on Broadway, where his father had entered a private room and emerged minutes later carrying a black envelope. He decided to start there. The next morning, Jason went to the bank. The place was quiet, with most of its visitors being wealthy businessmen and investors. He approached the receptionist and asked about accessing a safety deposit box using the key. The receptionist examined him carefully, then asked for his ID. Fortunately, his name was linked to the family account, so there wasn't much suspicion. The receptionist led him to a private room containing dozens of small metal boxes and pointed to one labeled R17. Jason inserted the key cautiously, his heart pounding. When he opened the box, he found an old file and a black envelope inside. He opened the file, and his eyes widened in shock. It contained legal documents and secret agreements between his father and Frank Harris, proving that Robert Miller had been involved in fraud and money laundering for decades. But worse, he found a contract signed by his father that included a dangerous clause, an agreement to assassinate Frank Harris in exchange for secretly buying his share of the company. Jason felt like he couldn't breathe. His father wasn't just a fraud. He was a killer too. He quickly closed the file and returned everything to the box, but he kept copies of the documents on his phone. When he left the bank, He knew everything had changed. He could never look at his father the same way again. But he didn't know that his father now knew he had discovered the truth. And the real battle had begun. Jason left the bank feeling as if the world around him was collapsing. The documents he had found weren't just evidence of his father's corruption. They were proof of a planned murder. This was no longer just about illegal deals or financial betrayal. It had crossed into territory he couldn't have imagined. But he knew something else. His father wouldn't let him keep this information. Before returning to his apartment, he decided to take precautions. He went to a crowded cafe in Midtown Manhattan, sat in a far corner, and pulled out his phone. He sent a copy of the documents to an independent lawyer he knew from college, named Michael Cooper, along with a short message. "If anything happens to me, send these documents to the press." He pressed send, then took a deep breath. There was no turning back now, but the moment he looked up, he felt someone watching him. A man in a black coat was standing near the entrance, staring directly at him. It wasn't just a passing glance. He was being watched intentionally. Jason tried to stay calm, but he realized things were escalating. He decided to leave the cafe, but he didn't go straight home. He drove around the city for hours, trying to make sure no one was following him. Eventually, he returned to his apartment, where he found something that made him freeze. His apartment door was slightly open. He quickly pulled out his phone and called the police, but he didn't go inside. He waited in his car, watching from a distance. Minutes later, he saw two men exit his apartment, dressed in black suits, and get into a sleek black car parked nearby. As the car drove off, Jason saw a familiar face in the backseat. Robert Miller. His father had been there, and he knew everything. The message was clear. This wasn't just surveillance. It was a direct warning. They had entered his apartment, searched his belongings, and possibly planted surveillance devices. Jason cautiously returned to his apartment after they left, realizing that his father had started the deadly game. There was no doubt now. He would either confront his father or disappear forever. Jason stood in the middle of his apartment, surveying the chaos left behind by his father's men. Drawers were open, papers were scattered, and even his computer had been flipped over. This wasn't just a search, it was a clear threat. "We know you know, and there's nowhere to hide." But Jason wasn't planning to run. He knew he was closer to the truth than ever before, and he had to act before his father made his move. He sat on the couch and took a deep breath. He had two choices: confront Robert directly or use the evidence he had to bring him down legally. But after seeing how his father operated, he knew playing by the law might not be enough. At that moment, he received a call. The number was unknown. "If you want the full truth, come to the old warehouse in Brooklyn. Tonight. Alone." He didn't need to guess who was calling. It was Frank Harris. The old warehouse, the final confrontation. In the middle of the night, Jason drove to the address Frank had given him. The warehouse was abandoned, and the streetlights barely illuminated the road. When he entered, he found Frank waiting by a metal table, with a black bag on it. "I knew you'd come," Frank said, lighting a cigarette. "Where's my aunt? Did you take her?" Jason asked sharply. Frank laughed coldly. "No, we didn't take her, but she disappeared before we got to her. Seems she's smarter than we thought. Then why am I here? What do you want?" Frank tossed the bag toward him and opened it. It was filled with documents, photos, and audio recordings, all evidence of Robert Miller's crimes. "Everything's here, Jason. The smoking gun that proves your father isn't just a fraud. He's a killer too." Jason hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Why are you helping me? Didn't you want him dead?" Frank smiled slowly. "I did. But after seeing how he started doubting you, I realized you have a chance to bring him down from the inside. You have the power to destroy him in the only way that truly hurts, by ruining his reputation and his empire." Jason was silent for a moment, realizing the gravity of what he was doing. But there was no turning back now. Before he left, Frank stopped him and said gravely, "Be careful, Jason. Your father won't give up easily, and he might decide to take you out before you can expose him." That was the most terrifying truth Jason had heard so far. Jason left the warehouse feeling the weight of the bag in his hand, as if it carried his entire future. He knew this evidence could destroy his father completely, but at the same time, it made him a direct target. He drove to the apartment of an old friend, Michael Cooper, the lawyer he had sent the documents to earlier. When he knocked on the door, Michael opened it quickly, eyeing him with concern. "Jason, what's going on? I got your message and saw the files. Are you okay?" Jason pushed the bag inside and closed the door behind him. "Not exactly, but I think I have enough to bring my father down." Michael opened the bag and began flipping through the papers and photos. After a few minutes of silence, he looked at Jason and said seriously, "This evidence is enough to convict your father and put him away for years. But the problem is, men like him don't fall easily. Robert has influence, money, and powerful connections. That's why I need a plan," Jason said, sitting tensely. "I can't hand this evidence directly to the police because he might be able to silence them. I need to release it publicly, in a way he can't stop." Michael thought for a moment, then said, "The press." Jason nodded. "But not just any newspaper. We need one he can't buy or threaten. One big enough to make his story spread quickly before he can contain it." Michael smiled and said, "I know the right place." The next day, Jason was sitting in the office of the New York Times, across from an investigative journalist named Elizabeth Kendall, known for her bold exposés. She was carefully reading the documents, her eyes widening with each page she turned. Finally, she set the papers aside and said, "If all of this is true, this is one of the biggest financial and political scandals of the decade." "It's true," Jason said confidently, "and I want him to pay." Elizabeth took a deep breath, then said, "We'll publish the story. But you need to know that your father won't go down without a fight. This will be a declaration of war on him." Jason smiled bitterly. "He started the war a long time ago. I'm just finishing it." The next morning, New York woke up to a massive scandal. Headlines blared. Robert Miller, the billionaire who built his empire on fraud and murder. The scandal spread like wildfire. Television, the internet, social media, everyone was talking about the deceit and crimes Robert Miller had committed. Within hours, federal authorities began to move. Jason knew his father would retaliate, but he wasn't prepared for what would happen next. The media storm that erupted from the investigation published by the New York Times had a massive impact. As Jason had predicted, his father's reaction was fierce. Robert Miller didn't remain silent. Instead, he launched a counter-campaign aimed at silencing anyone who dared to tarnish his reputation. Within days, news channels began portraying Robert as a victim of conspiracies, while the lawyers he hired from top law firms started threatening retaliation against the newspaper and anyone associated with the case. Jason knew this was just the beginning. His father was fighting to preserve his empire with all his might, and he wouldn't allow his son to bring him down so easily. But Jason wasn't afraid. He had uncovered damning evidence against his father, and he was determined not to back down. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. And he knew that backing down now would mean his father would escape punishment, and his chain of crimes would remain unbroken. A few days before a court hearing where the incriminating documents were set to be revealed, Robert summoned his son to his office in the company building. The meeting was tense, and both men knew they were on opposite sides. When Jason entered the office, his father was sitting behind his grand desk, flipping through some files. He looked up when he saw Jason and said coldly, "I didn't expect you to go this far, Jason." "Why? Why all of this?" "We're family," Jason replied, trying to keep his composure. "Family? That's been a lie from the start. You've been deceiving me all along." Robert shook his head. "You don't understand. Everything I did was for us, for our future. You can't destroy everything now." Jason smiled bitterly and said, "I destroyed everything myself. And now it's time for you to pay for your actions." There was a moment of silence. Then Jason approached the desk and pulled out the final file containing all the evidence. He placed it in front of his father, saying, "You started a war you weren't ready for, and now you're paying the price." Robert looked at the papers, then slowly raised his eyes, ready to challenge. "If you think this will end everything, you're wrong. It's already over. Everything's been published. You can't escape now." Before Robert could respond, one of his private lawyers entered the room, his face grim. "The police are here, Mr. Miller. You need to leave now." Yet, Robert refused to show weakness. He stood and said dryly, "You don't understand, Jason. I was always right. The world needs people like us." But Jason had completely severed ties with his past. He looked at his father one last time, then turned and walked out of the room. He didn't need to hear any more words. The decision had been made, and justice had begun to take its course. In the following days, Robert Miller's trial began. The courtrooms were packed with media, and the investigation was wide open, revealing a staggering number of crimes he had committed, from fraud and money laundering to involvement in assassinations. Robert was facing his fate, and Jason was the one who had led the world to the truth. Amid the unfolding events, Jason felt a sense of liberation. Although he had lost everything he thought was part of his identity, the truth had been revealed, and his father was now facing justice. Nothing would bring back the past, and nothing would restore the family as it once was. But Jason had learned that, in the end, even the most powerful figures, no matter how dangerous, must face justice. He was ready to move forward, knowing that a new ending awaited him.